Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and you are in the middle of a two-part conversation. This is your first time here. You're going to be like, oh no, this thing sounds horrible and boring, but hear me out. Give it a try. You're in the middle of a two-part conversation about the history of Roman coinage and what that coinage and that history would have meant in the minds of the people who were present in Matthew chapter 22 when some political enemies of Jesus show up and challenge him on whether or not it's right to pay taxes to Caesar and then pull out a Roman coin, a denarius. That's what we're working on, is getting all of that context and background set up for hopefully a big payoff next time around. That said, here's some music from Jeff, and we're going to get after it. Well, the funny thing about the denarius is even though it started out as a division of the true singular denomination of Roman currency, the assarius, at this point, the denarius, because it represents a day's work, kind of starts to take over, and everything is gauged off of this because the Roman legions, the basic Roman soldier, is paid in denarii. So it becomes a very important political issue to be debated as to what we're actually going to value that. What will a denarius be in relation to the rest of our currency? And so in the late Republic, what we see is a revaluing of the denarius, and through central planning, they just change what these coins are worth. Even though there are a gajillion of them in circulation, they're still changing it. And that creates a pretty serious crisis. A crisis that Julius Caesar and the politicians around the same time that he died tried to address by doubling the amount of denarii paid to a soldier or a day laborer employed by the Roman government per year. So even though the percentage of silver stayed the same roughly all through the whole era that we're talking about, it's like 98% all the way through this time, the value in relationship to other things was forcibly altered by Roman decree and Roman law. Now look, that only works to a certain extent. Ultimately, you can just melt down currency if it's made of an actual precious metal and recast it and just use the silver because the silver has value. So the fact that the late Roman Republic government has some success in revaluing a raw material like silver really does tell you something about the amount of power and influence that they wielded over everything in life, and especially over the currency that they put their faces on and that they were stamping and distributing as the main way that people did business with each other. Well, somewhere along the lines here in the late Republic or the Middle Republic, what we see is important leaders start to gain permission from the people because maybe the people just didn't do anything, or maybe the blessing of the Senate because the Senate feared these leaders. They started to be able to put their faces on them. They could strike coins. They could mint coins that had the head of a leader on the head's side of the coin, which is really quite a power gesture if you think about it. And I keep using that word mint, and I guess this is the place to talk about this important little rabbit trail, which really isn't a rabbit trail at all. This factors in closely to how people in the Roman Empire, I think, would have thought about coinage and the central authority of Rome to determine value and to make coinage and own the idea of money. This term mint is drawn from a particular temple that I don't think we know the exact location of it anymore, but it was on the Capitol Hill, the Capitoline Hill, which if you've ever been to Rome and you go to the Colosseum and then you walk through the old Roman Forum heading toward the great big white resplendent Vittorio Emanuele monument and Capitol building, just to the left of that building as you're standing in the Forum with the Colosseum at your back, if you're looking at the backside of the big white Capitol up there, to the right, you've got the very modest little Mamertine prison site where Paul and probably Peter were imprisoned before their executions. And to the left, you've got these steep stairs that lead up to a church named Santa Maria. I mean, aren't so many of them in Rome named Santa Maria. That church is at the top of the stairs. And then there's the Capitol Museum is up there as well, which is an incredible thing to spend a day touring through. And I've heard it suggested that where that Santa Maria church sits on top of that hill that overlooks the Forum and looks all the way down toward the Colosseum, on that spot or real close to it, there was a temple to a goddess named Juno Moneta. And it is a very well attested historical fact that in that temple and around that temple and a few auxiliary buildings is where Roman coins were minted. That's where the denarii came from. Right there at the Roman Forum, right there at the hill associated with the maximum power of the maximum headquarters of the maximum empire, biggest one the world's ever seen. Right there in that temple, Juno Moneta, they struck these coins all day long, just running the mint, clink, 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 churning out this money that was made of actual silver at this point. And if we're talking about the time of Julius Caesar, still about 98% pure. And then at some point, you got Roman citizens traveling to Rome with their kid, and they're like, hey, look at that temple right there, boy. That right there is where money is born, birthed by the gods. Put simply, Roman coinage was a religious exercise. And I mean, just look at it. You think, why wouldn't they just hand out the silver then? Why wouldn't that get it done? Well, there's value added by slapping this state religious brand and imagery right there on it. That tells a story. You are trading in a currency that has the full faith and credit of the goddess of money, the gods in general, and the empire that they bless and ordained. The full faith and credit of all of that on heaven and earth stands behind that piece of currency in your pocket. And if you're a Spanish speaker, you're like, oh, wait a second, moneta, like moneda, like coin, like money in general in Spanish? Yeah, exactly like that. And so we understand that the term mint is some sort of deterioration of the word moneta as well. And this old Roman goddess has appeared on all sorts of currencies from all over the Western world since then. So all of this is important because the original audience would be thinking of money as being something that Rome owns. They own the silver. They own the authority to say this is worth something. Maybe some of them even buy into a little bit this old pagan narrative that this authority to make money is backed by a goddess sent by, according to old Greek and Roman legends, the equivalent of Zeus's wife, Hera. This temple, this mint, this currency is part of the mythos of the power and authority of Rome. And to demonstrate that these new emperors, starting with Caesar Augustus, and now at the time of Christ, here as we look at Matthew chapter 22, you've got Tiberius Caesar, these emperors, to demonstrate that they are a part of this mythos as well, and a part of this pantheon of deities who make Rome happen and bless you with its governmental presence. To make this clear, they get to put their names on the coins as well. And to do so is effectively a claim to deity. But there's an irony to that claim of the denarius being the noble unit of currency handed down by the gods, bequeathed to you by the living God emperor who rules over all. There's a weakness to this that maybe the most politically attuned at this point, even in Jerusalem, even in the temple area, would have been aware of. And that is that late in the reign of the emperor Tiberius, you're starting to get a little bit of rumbling about currency reform. Tiberius famously went and rounded up like 675 million denarii, 675 million days' wages. It's unbelievable amounts of actual silver wealth to gather back to himself in the treasury of Rome and the emperor, some of this wealth that they had distributed all around the world. They had some projects, they had some stuff that they wanted to do, they had some splendor that they wanted to show off. And so there was some debate that was rumbling amongst the elites about maybe we need to reconsider how the denarius works. I mean, it's been a century since we've really messed with this thing. A few tweaks, and at the kind of volume that we own money at, we would make gajillions of dollars, and the common person wouldn't realize that their currency had been debased a little bit. They would just notice prices going up and ignorantly be like, what? Why is milk a little bit more expensive now? Oh, well, and just go on with it, while the elites who have unique control over the currency get crazy rich. Some people in the crowd with Jesus would have heard these rumblings. Most people would not have been thinking in this capacity. But everybody who read this account a generation, 2 generations, 5 generations, 10 generations down the road would have known the history of what happened with Roman currency shortly after Jesus had this exchange. Because starting with the reign of the Emperor Nero, this intentional currency debasement started to happen. It started small with Nero ordering the silver purity of a Neronian denarius reduced from 98% to 93%. That's not such a big deal. But what it allowed him to do was to take less silver and print up what, for the moment, until inflation catches up with things, is the same exact amount of money. No problem. Well, once Nero does that in the 60s, emperors who come afterwards are like, well, if we need more money, let's just do the same. We'll just print more, but we'll just do it with the same amount of silver. So we'll just drop that down to 83%, which is what happened during the era of the supposedly good emperors in the middle of the 2nd century. Well, it's not long after that, and we're into the middle of the 3rd century, and now the silver purity of these denarius are dropped to 48%. And at this point, the common person looks back and they're like, well, how come these coins would buy so much 100 years ago, according to the records, but now it just buys so little? Well, I guess it's just because things are always getting more expensive, but they're not. Things are always worth roughly the same amount. It's the value of currency that changes when a megastate like Rome has full and complete control over the thing. They can do whatever they want. They had projects and things they wanted to get done. I mean, stuff's expensive. You got harems and you got wars you have to have and foreigners you got to kill. And that stuff's pricey. And it costs money, and so you just ride the coattails of what a currency used to be worth, and you make a whole bunch more, and somebody a generation later can worry about the consequences of that. Well, by the time you get to the late 3rd century, the 270s, the silver purity of the denarius, a day's wage, remember that's still a day's wage, has been reduced all the way down to 5% silver purity. It was a lump of copper and other cheap ores with a thin veneer of silver over the top, which would easily scrape away. And that scraping away of the silver that started to happen in the late 270s and into the early 300s is sort of a metaphor for the collapse of Rome and the deterioration from what Rome had been in its glory days. The emperors had been lavish and financially abusive for an age. They tried to compensate for that in 2 ways: by debasing the value of currency while also raising taxes to try to bring in more silver, because you debase the currency. Now it takes way more taxation, a much larger percentage, a much greater burden on your citizenry to replenish the imperial coffers with the same amount of silver, because there's hardly any silver in the coins anymore. I think all of this factors in so greatly and adds so many layers of meaning to what is going on with this quick, simple little exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, Padawans, and the Herodians when they come and ask this question about taxation. And it just happens to, of course, it happens to be a denarius. And so I know this was a lot, but hopefully we can just put this all in our brain pocket for a minute. And then when we go back and look at the text, I think we're going to see the payoff. And you know what? If we don't, hey, we all learned something really interesting about the past and about how money happens. And I super had fun with that. Thank you so much for hanging out with me on these. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.